My name is Kelly Tebow, and I'm with the New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome and Associated Disorders. I will be your facilitator for this evening and would like to welcome you to our webinar on a neuroplasticity-based approach to tics. And let me tell you, that's a mouthful. Thank you all for joining us. Before I introduce the speaker for tonight, I'm going to cover some housekeeping items with you. All participants are muted. If you have a question, please type it in your question box and click send. You may send questions during the webinar. However, we will have Ms. Stoeber answer the questions at the end of her presentation. We will get to as many queries as time allows. In addition, tonight's presenter is available to take your questions on the Wednesday webinar blog, which is accessed from our homepage under the heading Programs. This blog will be monitored for the next 7 days. Feel free to look and post questions as often as you like. Answers will be archived for future reference. If you missed part of the webinar or would just like to watch it again, we will be posting a link to our YouTube URL. We'll be here. We'd love to hear from you about what you liked and didn't like about the webinar. We need everyone to fill out the survey as you exit the webinar. The New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome and Associated Disorders, its directors and employees assume no responsibility for the accuracy, completeness, objectivity, usefulness of the information presented. We do not endorse any recommendation or opinion made by any member or physician, nor do we advocate for any treatment. You are responsible for your own medical decisions. Now, I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening, Ms. Betsy Stoeber. Betsy Stoeber founded Brain Balance in New Jersey in 2010 following her own family's participation in the program. She is proud to have played a role in moving the program's core concept, the brain's neuroplasticity, can be leveraged to access the root development of developmental changes into the mainstream therapeutic approaches over the last decade. Betsy has led her caring and dedicated team in the service of hundreds of families and is a tireless advocate of strengthening rather than masking or accommodating when it comes to developmental issues. Betsy is a graduate of the University of Michigan and NYU's Stern School of Business and has a background in business and has 2 nearly adult sons who are a great source of pride. Betsy, I'm going to turn over the presentation to you now. We're so happy to have you.
Terrific. Thank you very much. I'm so happy to be here. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Sorry.
Well, it says connected to webinar.
Okay, let me just, there we go. Okay.
Yep.
So welcome to everyone. I'm thrilled to be here to talk to you about a topic that I am very passionate about. As Kelly suggested, that is looking at the symptoms of neurodevelopmental disorders as developmental immaturity and issues that we can really address by driving development in the brain and helping kids and adults that struggle with these areas of dysfunction to move forward and to kind of improve functionally. We're of course going to be talking about this in the context of tic disorders tonight, and over on the left-hand side of this screen, you'll see a child who is really making an effort. You can see that in his face that he's making an effort, and we're showing here a very simplified version of the brain system that he is activating in making that effort, and that is to suppress undesirable motor impulses or tics, and that's a real hint as to the topic of my talk tonight. And I want to tell you this is a very complex topic, and I've made a lot of effort myself to simplify it. And at the end of the talk, you will see a list of resources, and I think that the slides are going to be distributed to everybody who's registered tonight. And so you'll have an opportunity to go into greater detail and read some of the studies that I'm citing for yourself. But for the purposes of the discussion tonight, we're going to keep things a little simple. And yeah, so let me move to the next slide, which is an attempt. I know that I'm talking to an audience that probably knows more than the average person about tics, but I want to start by kind of getting us on the same page. And I want to start by talking about how tics feel to kids who are affected by them. And I went right to the source for this slide. I watched or rewatched the HBO documentary, I Have Tourette's, but Tourette's Doesn't Have Me, which is a very, very moving documentary where kids talk about what it's like to grow up with a tic disorder. And these are the types of things that the kids say in that documentary. They wonder, why they can't stop their tics. It feels bad to have something that's out of their control, that's affecting them every day. They talk about the fact that if they try to hold their tics in, that it's all they can do, it's all they can think about. It's really robbing them of a lot of the mental bandwidth that they need to just be a kid and learn at school and learn socially. A tic can feel like a compulsion, like I'm going to have to scratch this. It's too much for me. It's inevitable that I'm going to experience the tic, even if I'm holding it in. Kids can feel embarrassed, feel like it's weird, like they're disturbing people at school or elsewhere in their life by their tics, and that they just want kids to know that they're normal. They're just a normal kid like everybody else with the same feelings and, desires and dreams. So what happens when a child exhibits tics is that they can be classified into patterns of tics, can be classified into tic disorders. You all probably are familiar with that. And the classification is based on observed symptoms, and those have to do with everything from kind of the number and variety of different tics that an individual is experiencing, the age of onset, the frequency of the tics themselves, and then how long a person has experienced the symptoms. And down below on this slide are 3 tic disorders and kind of the criteria for diagnosing those tic disorders. And if we're asking what are tics, they are defined as sudden twitches, movements, or sounds that are made repeatedly. And as you all probably know, there are both motor tics and verbal tics. There are simple tics that are kind of like one-step tics, and then there are more complex tics that kids and adults can exhibit. And there, of course, has been a lot of thinking about where these tics come from, what the source is, and we still don't feel like we know definitively, I think, in general out in the literature, but the current status of that thinking about the source of tics is kind of moving away from the idea that there is a gene that is common to all Tourette's sufferers or all tic disorder sufferers. And one of the studies that I have cited in this presentation has a quote, "Tourette syndrome genetics research has been frustrating. Despite an apparent high heritability," meaning that people in the same family and different generations will all have issues with tics, association studies in terms of finding something that's a problem at the chromosomal level, a tic that is related to, a gene that is related to tic disorders, are largely barren. There's been a lot of looking into, is this a problem with dopamine release, kind of a neurochemistry problem in the brain? And again, there's little evidence of that. And so now there has been a real shift in direction looking at functional connectivity in the brain as the potential source of tic disorders. And there is, as it says here, increasing evidence that circuitry problems of brain systems associated with social decision-making within the larger social behavior networks in the brain are behind tics. So, what are these circuitry problems? What does that actually mean? And again, here is another quote. These circuitry problems are about the way different regions of the brain are creating neural pathway connections so that they can work effectively together. And that's something, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, but that's something that is part of normal brain development throughout childhood and into young adulthood and into adulthood. The brain is making these circuits between its regions. And here is another quote from the study that I talked about on the last page. The emergence of involuntary movements, vocalizations, and subsequent natural history of Tourette's syndrome follows a predictable pattern in the first 2 to 3 decades of life, suggesting that Tourette's syndrome results from altered brain development trajectories. And I want you to hold on to that because I'm going to come back to that idea of the developmental trajectory of the brain and how that can be altered. So first, a couple of additional truisms regarding tics, or things that people kind of generally accept to be true about tic disorders. The age of onset is really this middle childhood period of time, 6 to 10 years old. That's the most common age range for tics to make themselves apparent. They're more frequent in boys than in girls. We know that most people experience intermittent symptoms. They can come and go. They can reappear after a time that they don't seem to be there anymore. One tic can start and kind of go through its lifespan and remediate, and another tic can appear as that first tic is remediating. That's kind of the nature of tic disorders. Tics can impede daily function. They can really get in the way of school and a job and social life, and they can make people feel bad and embarrassed, and they can cause stress, and tics can get worse when a person is stressed. The act of trying to suppress tics can be very tiring, and it can really eat up a lot of that mental bandwidth, like I said on the slide with the child on it. And that can really get in the way of academic learning and social learning. And, you know, we've seen a lot of kids who are diagnosed with tic disorders and also learning disabilities because it's really hard to be at school and learning when you're working hard to suppress tics. And, you know, in a worst case scenario, tics can be self-injurious and they can cause pain or harm. So these are serious issues, and we really want to figure out how to help kids move past or overcome tics because they are problematic. Another thing we know is that they are almost always comorbid with other neurodevelopmental issues, other issues that are about the timing of development of the brain. And some examples of neurodevelopmental disorders that you probably are all familiar with are ADHD and anxiety, OCD, autism spectrum disorders, learning disabilities, sensory processing disorders, and of course there are more. Medication and behavioral treatments do exist and have limited effectiveness, but it's generally thought that there is no cure for tic disorders. And what we know about the course of tic disorders is that they most often decrease during adolescence and into early adulthood, and often they disappear entirely. People grow out of tic disorders. And you know what's really happening is that compensatory neuroplastic changes in the brain are allowing an individual's brain to catch up developmentally, resulting in function that is more like the function in terms of suppressing undesirable impulses that we expect. So we have to talk about that because that is really important, this idea that tics are a developmental problem and that the normal course of development in a human being who is experiencing tics is for them to remediate over time. So here we have this very clear statement: neuroplastic changes in brain structure and connectivity control tics over time and help move the brain onto a more typical developmental trajectory. So you remember what we said on that earlier slide about an atypical developmental trajectory. So to understand this, we really have to talk about what is neuroplastic change. Neuroplastic change is the nature of the human brain. And the human brain has been called an organ of surreal complexity. And it's almost like a joke that human beings have to use their brains to try to understand their brains, but the brain is too complex for human beings to truly understand it, although we are making headway. There have been big advances in the understanding of the functioning of the brain in the last 10 to 15 years. But generally, it's considered the most complicated organ known in nature. We're born and we have about somewhere in the ballpark of 100 billion specialized brain cells that are called neurons. And over the course of life, with experience and stimulation and practice and action and effort, those neurons fire and wire together to create in the ballpark of 100 trillion neural pathway connections. And taken together, those neural pathway connections or functional connections in the brain are really the neurological equivalent of learning and skill mastery. There is a pretty good understanding at this point of what typical wiring of the human brain looks like, typical functional connectivity, and that's referred to as the human connectome. And there was an article about a week or so ago in the New York Times about the project of mapping the fruit fly connectome, that a group of scientists are working hard at understanding all of the connections in the brain of the fruit fly. And it's not because they so desperately want to understand the fruit fly, it's really kind of a precursor and an ability to look at a more simple brain in the process of really coming to understand the expected connectivity of the human brain. But what we know is that typical wiring enables typical function, typical self-regulation, typical physical coordination, skill mastery, understanding of language, picking up of social cues. All of that typical function is dependent on typical wiring in the brain. We know that disorders in the observable developmental disorders involve predictable differences in the functional connectivity of the brain. A person who is skilled at looking at brain scans can look at an atypical pattern of connectivity and know what type of symptoms that person is going to have just based on those atypical connections. And those wiring differences are very, very often detectable way ahead of symptoms. And that's true in developmental issues like autism. We know that we can look at scans of 6-month-olds' brains if they are not making eye contact or showing interest in other people. And we can see that important connections are not establishing themselves at 6 months old and kind of say, we better step in and intervene because this is likely to result in the symptoms of autism by about 2 years old. I have a book over, the cover of a book over on the right-hand side of this screen, Brainscapes by a neuroscientist named Rebecca Schwarzlose. It's a book I'm reading right now, and it's really, really interesting talking about the wiring of the brain. So if you're interested and you want some more literature for regular people, that's a great book to read. But the important thing to know is that all through life, the brain can change. People hear sometimes that what you get in terms of development in your child by age 5 is what you're going to get, and after that, it's not possible to change things anymore. That is really not true. Neuroplasticity changes, and it changes for really good reasons. And the brain's neuroplasticity at 6 months old or 2 years old is quite different than the kind of responsiveness of neuroplasticity later in life. But we remain people who can learn and master skills and get better at our golf swing or our, ability to throw a basketball all through our lives. And it's important that we know that because that will help us in addressing these neurodevelopmental issues. So how does the building of the human connectome start? It really starts in the womb. Experiences that we have in the womb get that process started, and then we're born. And the stimulation of the world that we're born into is what drives brain development. Being born with the right equipment is not enough. And this is a wonderful article, Baby's Brains the First Year, that was in National Geographic a number of years ago. And this is also on the list of resources that you'll see at the end of the presentation. And it really makes the case that there is this lightning pace of development in the first year of life. You can see in this graph on the lower left, the x-axis is time, with the shaded area being the first year of life, and the y-axis is the number of neural pathway connections. And you can see that at the time of birth, there are very limited number of neural pathway connections that are kind of all about the experience that a baby has in the womb. And the baby is born, and all sorts of different types of connections just skyrocket. And around 6 months old, the number of the connections in the brain kind of peaks. And they are not very sophisticated connections, but there are a lot of them. And that really makes such a difference in the way a 6-month-old is functioning and connecting with the world versus a newborn. But then what you see happening is that neural pathway connections start refining through practice of different activities. And the brain really is great at pruning, or kind of getting rid of, cleaning out obsolete connections that we don't need. And so the rest of life is really about having neural pathway connections refine themselves, get stronger, get better and better at what they're supposed to be doing. As you see here, repeated activation strengthens and refines circuits, and lack of using connections over time, that pruning process can do away with some of those obsolete connections. Dysfunction is observable when brain wiring isn't typical, like I said before. And the other thing that this article does really well is talk about how there is appropriate intervention to step in and influence the development of the brain, the wiring of the brain, and that can lead to strengthening of existing connections and the building of connections between regions that didn't form previously based on the individual's prior life experiences, and that this process of strengthening and building connections in the brain can really improve life. It can improve lots of different areas of function. So how does neuroplasticity play a role in overcoming tics? Well, there is really a ever-growing body of research about this topic. And increasingly, Tourette syndrome research is really focused on functional connectivity, and how a certain system of brain regions is learning to work together over time to build more typical function. And it's really focusing on the idea that suppression of tics is part of typical human development. It's a lot like learning to read social cues and respond appropriately. It's a lot like learning to not have a meltdown and control your emotional reactions, and academic learning, and learning different motor skills and more. And here is a quote from this lower right-hand study. Increased control over motor outputs, including suppression of tics, may develop during adolescence in Tourette syndrome and be accompanied by compensatory neuromodulatory alterations in brain structure and function. And that is the thesis of what is happening as people age out of tics. So this systems perspective, and again, this is a very simplified way of looking at this very complex brain system, this neuroanatomical system, is really made up of a part of the brain. It's actually a collection of structures in the brain that we refer to as the basal ganglia, working together with the cortex and the cerebellum. Those are the key parts of this tic suppressing system in the brain. And what they do is they work together to kind of select and maintain appropriate responses and generate behaviors according to what is thought of as appropriate. And they inhibit inappropriate responses. I'm just going to show you this picture of the bouncer over on the right-hand side of the page, the basal ganglia are collectively sometimes referred to as the bouncer of the brain, because they play this really important role in deciding who gets, what impulses get to come out, and kind of keeping the door shut for undesirable impulses. And what we know is that there are systemic differences in this brain system in people who have the symptoms of Tourette's syndrome. Some of the brain structures in that system are known to be immature, and there will be atypical interactions between the brain regions in this system and atypical functional connectivity or neural pathway connections between those regions. And what's really interesting is that same dysfunction is implicated in other neurodevelopmental disorders like OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And here's a quote from that study: ADHD is common in Tourette's, as are anxiety disorders and OCD. Often arising to, obsessive compulsive behaviors often arising to the level of OCD. And here is a really interesting idea. You know that we look at autism as a spectrum of disorders. We look at anxiety disorders as being a spectrum, attention deficit issues as being kind of on a spectrum, with different types of ADHD. And this researcher says it is plausible to view simple tics and complex obsessions as the poles on a spectrum of compulsive behaviors, with kind of more simple compulsive behaviors like needing to, move a curtain so that it's even occupying the middle of that spectrum. So I think that's a really kind of different way of looking at tics than many people have been led to in the past. This is a graphic that we use a lot at Brain Balance, where I work, to kind of get this idea across of simple connections being important in more complex neural pathway networks. Sticking up above the surface of the water are lots of different areas of complex skill mastery where you have to use lots of brain regions together as networks, things like being able to direct your focus and attention to things that you need to, even if they're not super interesting to you, the ability to pick up on social cues and respond appropriately, the ability to control your behaviors and kind of not explode over something small, the ability to learn academically and control repetitive anxious thoughts, or to work in ways that are goal-oriented, like what we consider executive function. All of those abilities are based on many more foundational areas of function coming together, creating neural pathway connections, and operating in these synchronized ways. So what is the promise of plasticity-based interventions for neurodevelopmental issues? I'm going to turn to Dr. Michael Merzenich, who was on the neuroscience faculty at UC San Francisco, which is very well known for its neuroscience department. He's an author. He is really considered the father of neuroplasticity. You see on the lower right-hand side of this page a book that he wrote called Softwired, which is all about the brain's ability to grow and change. And then at the research paper that I've copied a shot of is really a wonderful research paper, brain plasticity-based therapeutics. I encourage you to take a look at that if you find this interesting. But he says brain plasticity-based therapeutics can be expected to drive fundamental renormalizing corrections for distorted brain systems. That's really what he sees as the future. He calls neurodevelopmental disorders failure modes of the self-organizing brain. That's the idea from that National Geographic article, that the brain is organizing itself starting with birth and moving into childhood. The brain is going through a well understood process of organizing itself, if only it is, staying on that typical path and responding to experience in the way that we expect. He says we have very clear insight into brain-changing processes, both in the directions that we don't want the brain to be changing, to kind of degrading directions, losing function, having compulsions become more and more set and stronger, but also in the strengthening, rejuvenating, and corrective direction, which is what we're talking about, the ability to use that neuroplasticity to strengthen an individual and help them function better. And he is a real believer that the future will involve brain remodeling that's induced on a large scale, can really help with lots of different symptoms, and truly at any age. How do we do that in my program, Brain Balance, the program I work for? Well, we, use this idea that we have to stimulate the brain and provide experience in a lot of different modalities integrated into one approach and practiced frequently and intensively. We're combining a lot of different modalities, and you see over on the right-hand side of the page, you see kids who are working in our centers and using lots of modalities together. And we do this strengthening work in a progressively challenging way that requires that participants are really having active, purposeful, intentional control over the systems of their body and directing those systems of their body using their brains. Doing this all together, many modalities in an integrated way, reflects the complexity of the real world that, as we've talked about before, is what jumpstarts neuroplastic change in the brain and causes the brain to be on that typical path of development. And by making a plan that is targeted based on what we know about the individual, and sticking with it and supporting a family to kind of get across the finish line, we can really move the needle developmentally for kids. We can improve the speed and efficiency of the neural pathways in the brain, help out with that firing together, and then we see with practice the wiring together that results in stronger, more synchronized skill mastery. As brain connections become more typical, that leads to more typical function across the board. And that's really, I think what we would hope for any kid who was struggling with a developmental issue. How do we know that this works? Well, there's a lot of research that supports using brain plasticity-based approaches. We are just coming to the end and in our program of an independent study of our program by a researcher at Harvard Medical School and McLean Hospital in Boston. And we're thrilled because he has really taken a look at these multimodal activities and seen profound effects in the group of kids who participated in his study in terms of observable improvement in their symptoms, measurable performance. In this case, it's looking at focus and attention. And using brain scanning equipment, he has seen real improvement in functional connections in the brain. Those are more consistent and stronger. This study we love because he used multiple assessments in all three of those areas. The first one prior to kids doing any kind of integrative activity, and then providing them with what they needed to do 16 weeks of this activity, and then doing a second test right at the end and seeing improvement on all three of those measures, but then sending them home to lead their lives for half a year and bringing them back in and doing those tests again. And this is really what is so exciting, is that Dr. Teicher and his team saw persistence of benefits of doing this work, that half year down the road after not being involved in daily exercise, seeing that kids had improved on all of those fronts. And that's what we call true neuroplastic change, and really helping a brain to be moving forward on a typical and positive trajectory. The other way that we know that the approach works is from the replicable results that we achieve for families that come and do this work with us, and parent-reported success. And that is what's truly exciting. And here are some quotes from parents of kids who came to us with tic disorders, talking about how taking a neuroplasticity-based approach is life-changing. That they feel that their child has accomplished a lot, moved forward. I love this this report from a mom that her son has been on the news at school and done weather reports and news reports, things that really put him out there in front of his peers, and that he's not shy or not embarrassed to do that. And then finally, this quote from a mom who says that a year and a half later, although they hear an occasional snorting noise, that their child really has a normal social life. And again, that is the kind of outcome that is wonderful and that we want to achieve. So in summary, we know the course of tic disorders, and we know that the fact that many, many of them remediate fully by early adulthood is about development and growth and aging out of the problem. And in promoting beneficial neuroplastic change and putting effort into that kind of work, we can help people get to that point of being able to suppress tics and control them sooner. And that is the message I hope that you leave this talk with. And there's so much more to know about this and to talk about. I'd love to take some questions if you have them. And I've also included my contact information. And then here is the list of resources that I have mentioned during the course of the talk.
Well, Betsy, thank you very much for all of that information. I really do appreciate it. So we've had several questions come in. The first was, I thought it was a myth that people with tics or TS have their tics go away in adulthood. I know there was a study that discussed even the people who thought their tics had gone away experienced tics when watched on video, but didn't even pay attention to them anymore.
So I think I understand all the parts of that question or statement, and it is considered the typical course of having tic disorders that they kind of go in an arc. We see the onset in that middle childhood range, 6 to 10. And then we usually see them be at their most intense kind of in the 10 to 14-year-old range. And then we typically see, not in everybody, there are definitely adults with Tourette's, adults with tic disorders, but in the majority of cases, we see those tics start to remediate. In terms of the second part of your question, I'm sorry, Kelly, can you repeat the end of that question?
Sure.
There was something, oh, I know, I think
So
it was
it says
about.
there was a study that discussed that people who thought their tics had gone away experienced tics when they were watched on video.
Oh, that's interesting. So I don't know about that study, but what I do know is a lot of taking a look at how when people are distracted, when they're really like mentally engaged in something that they love or that interests them, that they aren't experiencing tics. And so that's interesting too. You know, what is it about a very engaged brain that enables a person not to have tics? So, you know, I think these are all really good questions, and I think that there's still research to be done about, you know, all of the dynamics of the experience of tics.
Okay. So what are your thoughts on the recent increase in individuals, mostly teen girls, seeking assessment for new or late onset tics? Do you use all the same modalities for functional tics and TS, or are they treated differently?
So I would treat them the same. I mean, I think so, and I'm not an expert on this system in tic disorders. You know, we use neuroplasticity-based approach to address lots of symptoms of neurodevelopmental disorders. But this idea of like later onset of tics can absolutely, if this is a problem of the social decision-making networks in the brain, it can follow that a person who is increasingly stressed about social decision making and has some weakness in the connectivity in the brain can go through, the brain is constantly shifting the focus of development throughout childhood and into early adulthood. So we kind of think of adulthood as being reached neurologically by about 25. And it's interesting because car rental companies, for example, won't rent to people who are under 25, and that's for a reason. You really haven't reached adulthood and decision-making ability of an adult until you're 25. And so, you know, the emphasis of development shifts to different regions during the course of teenage years, young adulthood, and we can see people move into a time where the parts of the brain that are performing that that motor impulse suppressing function are overwhelmed, are stressed. They are in social situations that are too much for them to just handle easily. And we can see tics as a result of that. So I hope that that makes sense what I'm saying.
Okay. The next question starts off, this presentation has been lovely. Two questions, however. Can you re-explain the spectrum issue you included on one of the slides? Issue of mind in the middle was confusing.
Sure. So this is a researcher looking at the nature of simple tics and looking at the nature of complex compulsions, you know, the really complex things that people who get an OCD diagnosis, for example, can sometimes experience, needing to take a certain number of breaths before they walk through a door, or feeling like the world is going to come to an end if they don't do that, and having these complex compulsions that they feel a need to follow. And that researcher is saying that all of those are kind of uncontrolled impulses, going from very simple to very complex. And he's saying that at the middle of that spectrum, from one pole, simple pole, to complex pole, are kind of the more simple compulsions that we know people have, the compulsion to set something straight, or to have both light switches be up or down and not one up and one down. You know, these things that we hear about regularly as kind of simple compulsions that don't always rise to the level of an obsessive compulsive disorder diagnosis.
Okay. And part two of the question, have there been benefits of the kind of exercise you discussed about the children who demonstrate tics? Are they just more confident, or do they actually have fewer symptoms due to the exercises, or is it time passing?
So I love this question. And, you know, let me tell you that after over 10 years, I kind of feel like I know when a child comes to us and is experiencing tics. I kind of know what things are likely to look like. Not every kid responds to this strengthening process in the same way, but I most often tell parents that when they're coming to us and their child starts in our program, that whatever they've experienced in the past in terms of a tic, like the onset of a tic and then it becoming more prevalent, you know, parents will describe to me that they'll see their child do something new and they'll think, oh, is that a new tic? And then over a little bit of time, they will say, yes, that's absolutely a new tic. We're seeing it now pretty frequently, and this is the next tic that's coming. And maybe concurrently, they'll see that an older tic goes away and they're not seeing it anymore. So that tic is remediated. This new tic has become kind of the primary tic that is being experienced. And then over time, they'll start to do that a little less frequently. So I'm calling that kind of the lifespan of the tic, and then eventually it remediates fully. What we see in our program as kids are doing this work to strengthen connections in the brain is that very often the life cycle of a tic will shorten dramatically. It'll kind of intensify. Families will see a new tic, and within a day or so, they're seeing a lot of it. And within a relatively short period of time compared to the past, that tic is like worked out of the system and they don't see it anymore, but maybe another tic happens like right away. So that compression of the timeline of tics is something that we see as kids go through this process. And then little by little, you know, what parents report. I have a wonderful mom who was one of the first 10 parents to enroll her child with us back in 2010. And she, for years, wrote to us with an annual update on how her son was doing. And, you know, what I know from talking to her is that by about 6 months from the end of her son's 6 months with us in the program, so about a year after they first came to us, they really didn't see anything anymore, no tics anymore. Occasionally he would do something a little bit repetitively and they would think, is that a tic? But, you know, and along with that remediation of the tics and him not having to put so much effort into suppression anymore, he started to blossom academically. And he ended up moving out of a learning disabled classroom and becoming a mainstream student. He's now, I think, a junior in college. And, you know, that kind of process, it doesn't happen overnight. It's not waving a magic wand. And the process of strengthening parts of the brain and putting effort can be fatiguing to some individuals. And so for a period of time, we can see that the tics are more intense. But generally, we see the individual kind of work their way out of experiencing tics. I hope that answered the question.
Okay.
Oh, you asked about self-confidence. So what I wanted to say is that if not having tics leads a child to feel more confident and to be able to go out and put themselves out in front of other kids and have the spotlight shined on them a little bit more, and then success leads to more confidence, then that confidence is absolutely driving their experience and driving new connections. And so, you know, I don't want to say that confidence isn't an important part of this. Of course it is, but it's all kind of part of that becoming more typical in how you're functioning.
Okay. What are the multiple modalities you referred to?
So the doctor who created our program really worked to include ways of working on developing regions of the brain, as many different modalities as he could. So first of all, sensory systems. We are working on strengthening an individual's ability to do auditory processing, have the brain really be able to make sense of what they're hearing, and improving visual function in lots of different ways, right? There's basic eye reflexes, there is ocular motor coordination, how the two eyes work together, convergence and divergence. There is visual processing and how the brain makes sense of what a person is seeing. There is the kind of movement involved in eye tracking, like when your eyes reach the end of a line of text, their ability to jump to the beginning of the next line of text. So those are all visual system modalities that we can work in. There is balance and rhythm and timing and core muscle strength and engagement. And there are cognitive modalities, the ability to make inferences or think about cause and effect relationships or comprehend what you're reading or hearing. And so our program strives to incorporate as many scientifically validated tools that are known to improve function in as wide a range of modalities as we can into that single program, and have them all be moving forward. And increasingly, as kids move up levels, they're using all of those areas of function together in more and more synchronized ways. So you can think about, from what I said during the talk, that that is putting some real concerted effort into building the brain's ability to use all of these foundational systems in more and more complex combinations. I hope that's helpful.
How many kids were part of the study with Harvard and McLean?
So, okay, and there is a link on our website. I failed to put the link in the list of resources, but if you go to our website, you can follow the link to scientific research, and that will take you to a summary and the preliminary write-up of the research done at Harvard. Initially, it was something like 60 children. And they ended up using, in the formal conclusions, they ended up using a smaller group than that, because not everyone, people were given these exercises to do, and they were asked to report on how frequently they were doing them, because there was a kind of floor that they wanted to reach to create the statistics for the study. And not every family logged in and did these exercises frequently enough to be included in the results of the study. I think it was about half the families reached the number of times that Dr. Kaysher had set. But the really interesting thing in talking to him and hearing from him is that the people who didn't do enough of the exercise to be included in the study results still reported improvements in the way their children were functioning. So, you know, what does that say? It says doing more of this work is even more effective than doing less of it, but even doing some of it can be very helpful.
Okay. How do you compare this therapeutic approach to, say, CBIT?
So I am really not familiar enough to comment on that. But what I will say is that people recognize aspects of other therapies in brain balance. And that is because really what makes brain balance different is pulling together many proven approaches that have been shown to strengthen individual areas of function. It's pulling lots of components of those proven approaches into a single multimodal integrated program. So I am sorry that I can't comment on how that compares to the therapy that you mentioned. But you know, feel free to call me and talk to me about the therapy that you're talking about, and I'm very happy to comment further and to help you think through how what we're doing is different.
I'm sorry, the CBIT stands for Comprehensive Behavioral Intervention for Tics.
Okay.
It is a something that was developed, and psychologists and licensed clinical social workers usually implement it.
So what I would guess, and this is just my guess, not knowing that therapy well, what I would guess is that it is kind of like maybe ABA, where you are repeating something many times. And, you know, what I just said to you tonight in this presentation is that practice and repetition, you know, does change the brain over time. And the difference in the approach of really getting to the brain's neuroplasticity and jumpstarting change in this general way is that you are not just working on repeating one behavior or one action, you're strengthening really the broad foundation of human function. I hope that makes sense. Instead of looking at a specific behavior and looking to address that one behavior, you're strengthening the whole foundation of the brain. And so that has the potential to strengthen regions that aren't associated with tic disorders, but are associated with other issues that are so often comorbid, as we discussed.
Okay. Can you do your program via telehealth?
So before COVID, we are, you know, I'm sure you've heard many stories of people becoming more flexible in their delivery of their service or product since COVID. Before COVID, we were really a very much in-person program. And very quickly, we had to continue to work with our enrolled families when we had to shut down back in March of 2020. And it was really interesting because we had the program that Dr. Teicher had used in the study in Boston to kind of work off of and give us confidence. And we really much enhanced the program that was used in the Harvard study and created our remote program. And since kind of June of 2020, we have had many families enroll with us remotely. There's no one way to do this integrated multimodal work. It just is about consistency, frequency, and intentional effort. And so we can really work with families to help them do the lion's share of this work at home through that virtual approach.
Okay. Do you have an opinion about programs like Attentive, a brain training program using video game with headsets as a way to retrain the brain?
So I know that there are many video game-based, gamification-based brain training tools. Certainly in my line of work, I hear about a lot of them and see them. And I have no doubt that, those are things that the nature of video games are very engaging to children's brains. It's really a way to stimulate the brain through the visual system and activate lots of regions. But I truly believe that in order to create this step-by-step progressive strengthening of all of the systems of the body, we have to be using motor movement. We have to be using sensory systems. We have to kind of get back to the basics and use simple methods for strengthening systems of the body the way they evolved to work. And we certainly didn't evolve to receive so much of our stimulation through looking at moving light pixels. And, I could be proven wrong through a study that shows that there are ways to use screen-based activities to really excite and stimulate and activate all of the regions of the brain. But my question is really, when we can use the systems of the body to engage with the world and to build muscle, why wouldn't we do that? So that's my opinion. And, that's something I would love to continue to talk about and read about.
Okay. My 6-year-old son started excessively blinking about a month ago. I was worried and was told by his pediatrician that it was a habitual tic and would pass. What is the time frame, or when should I be concerned?
So I'm really glad that you asked that question, because one of the things that I say all the time to families is that development, although we have developmental milestones and pediatricians can ask a question at the 6-month appointment and the 1-year appointment and so on about whether a child is meeting those milestones, like it said on the page about the National Geographic article, being born with the right equipment isn't enough. Development is about experiences, stimulation, having those experiences and stimulation be very diverse, lots of different sources of stimulation driving development, and it's about how responsive a specific individual's brain is, the genes that drive brain development, how responsive they are to that multimodal experience and stimulation. And so what you do as a parent, the actions you take to engage your child in that really wide range of experiences and sources of stimulation will influence your child's development. So although, like I said before, I can tell parents what we typically see with a child with tics who comes and participates in our program, and parents can talk to me about the extent to which their child's experience with tics mirrors what they were told was going to be typical. No one can tell you exactly what is going to happen with your child. Your child is on a path of development that is influenced by their life. We call these issues epigenetic issues instead of genetic issues, because it's really how an individual's genes respond to environmental and experiential factors. And you know, what I would say to you is, if you feel that the tic that you're seeing is joined by another tic, you know, you're starting to see moving towards the criteria for a tic disorder diagnosis that I showed you on that earlier page, you know, that's a sign that the issue is going in that, you know, as Merzenich put it, a kind of degrading or detrimental direction, instead of your son's brain strengthening and moving in a corrective direction. And so I would watch very carefully. I would make a real effort to have your son have lots of physical activity and lots of mixed experiences, and to, you know, try things and use his muscles and not spend all his time you know, doing sedentary activities, things like that. And then I would watch for the symptoms of other usually comorbid neurodevelopmental issues. If it seems like he has a hard time directing his attention towards things that the teacher is asking him to do, he's not really kind of able to shift his attention. It stays stuck on something that he kind of intensely focuses on, like Minecraft or Pokemon or trains or dinosaurs, and that's all he really wants to talk about and think about. We call that perseveration. So that's a kind of symptom of neurodevelopmental issues. Or if he has things that he's anxious about and you reason with him and you try to explain to him why those things aren't dangerous for him, but his mind kind of stays stuck on those things, and that might be moving in the direction of more anxious thinking or anxiety. If you see some sensory issues, you know, if you start to see other issues, then I would definitely, you know, be more concerned. So hopefully that's helpful. But if you just see one tic and your pediatrician isn't concerned, you know, I don't think that you should be tremendously worried.
Great. I think we have time for one last question for the evening. Could you please give an example of what a program for a child with tics might look like?
Sure. And this is the really interesting thing about a neuroplasticity-based approach. The program for a child who comes to us and is experiencing tics is actually really similar to the program for a child who comes to us and is experiencing anxiety or trichotillomania, you know, pulling out patches of their hair, or a child who just is having trouble reading social cues and is having trouble making friends, or a child who might be considered twice exceptional, you know, really strong academically, but immature in terms of their self-regulation and their ability to connect with other people. Everybody is going to go through a multimodal, intensive program made up of beneficial strengthening activities that are targeted to the degree that we can target them based on what we know about the child and what that means in terms of the regions of their brain that are underdeveloped. So parent observations are really the most important part of our assessment process of us getting to know a family. But a family will come in and we'll work with the child for about an hour, and we'll do some sensory motor testing, we'll do some cognitive testing. Our program director will make some observations of the child, and then we'll kind of pull that all together into a report and meet with the parent and talk about how we would design a program. But the difference between programs is about the starting points in this progressively challenging program, more than it is about only including certain activities. Because what we want to see is that the brain is responding to this intensified, frequent exercise that is being done over a concerted, a period of time of like 3 to 6 months, depending on what we see in the assessment. And I will tell you that kids with tic disorders, typically they're more in the 6-month range than shorter, because it just takes a little bit more of this work to strengthen those parts of the brain that suppress tics. But everybody is going to be doing a program that is that multimodal approach to get lots of regions of the brain activated and lots of regions of the brain better and better at making connections together.
Terrific. Thank you all for joining us tonight on our webinar, A Neuroplasticity-Based Approach to Tics. There is an exit survey, which we need everyone attending to fill out. The webinar blog is open now and available for the next 7 days for any additional questions that were not covered tonight. That website is www.njcts.org. Also, an archived recording of tonight's webinar will be posted to the site. Our next presentation, IEP in 504, Are You Eligible and How to Begin, will be presented by Andrew Meltzer, Esquire, and is scheduled for December 8th, 2021. This ends tonight's webinar. Thank you, Ms. Stoeber, for your presentation, and thank you everyone for attending. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.